All right, folks. So today we're going to talk about the government under the Articles of Confederation, which was the first national attempt of American democracy. It was a pretty decent try for their first time around. It was instituted during the American Revolution. By 1781, we are still at war with England. We haven't signed the Treaty of Paris yet. That's still 2 years off. And the document's going to last for about 8 years till around 1789, when we're going to come up with a better government system that's going to last us for much longer. Today, we're going to talk about some of the issues the articles developed and some of the successes of the articles. So we're going to start with money issues. Money was a real problem during this time period for 8 years, largely because there was no national currency. Well, actually, there was a national currency. It just wasn't worth anything. The best you could buy was virtually nothing. The way you went about making purchases was with state currency, and every state had a different monetary system. So here's a $10 note from New York, 5 shillings from Massachusetts, and a $250 note from Virginia. Now, the problem with this is that currencies held different values in different states. So if you went to Pennsylvania and tried to use a $10 note, you might only be using a $5 Pennsylvania currency. So you need double that to make your purchase. If you go from Massachusetts to Connecticut, your Massachusetts currency might be worth 2 times that in Connecticut, meaning you need 5 shillings to pay for something that's worth 10 Connecticut dollars. On top of that, the government also had no system to raise money. Basically, the national government didn't have the power to tax, largely because the citizens were concerned with a repeat of King George III in Parliament all over again. So they gave the states the power to tax, and the states made contributions to the national government. Every state contributed a certain percentage of their tax revenue, but the national government couldn't fund a national army because they had no money to do so. There was no tax revenue coming in. Another big issue had to do with Western land claims. You can see out here in blue that there's land that was once owned by New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, North Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia. But there's no land owned by states like Maryland or Delaware or New Jersey or Connecticut or Rhode Island. And that made these smaller states really concerned that the big states like New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Carolina, and Georgia might take them over and run them out of the government altogether. So eventually they had to negotiate a plan to let these states like New York and Connecticut and Massachusetts cede their land to the national government. Once that land got passed over to the national government would then decide what to do with it. And this is what they would end up doing. They would create the Land Ordinance of 1785. So because the government is virtually broke, because there's no system of taxation, they have to come up with a way to make money. So in 1785, they passed this law, which outlined the process through which land could be sold to settlers from the federal government. They would basically divide the states and the territory into townships, which were 6 square miles by 6 square miles, so 36 square miles altogether. They would then subdivide that into 36 sections, which would equal 640 acres or 1 square mile per block. They would sell that land off at a minimum of $1 per acre and a minimum of 640 acres per purchase. So the minimum you could pay was 640 acres, which means that not any small farmers can afford that. But once you had a block right here, you could split it into halves, quarters, eighths, etc., and that was a little bit more affordable for those small-time farmers. The money the government would use, would help fund public schools and help pay off debt from the American Revolution. Now, as more people settled further and further west, we have to figure out a system to give them rights as citizens of the United States and eventually let them be states in the Union. And this is what they came up with. This was actually one of the major accomplishments of the Confederation Congress. I'm going to start with statehood. So to become a state in the U.S. under this idea, you had to have a Congress that would appoint 3 judges and a governor to govern your territory. Once you reached a population of 5,000 adult male landowners, you would then elect a territorial legislator. Please note, women and children didn't matter at all in this population count, just adult males. Once this population of your territory reached 60,000 people, you could elect delegates to a state constitutional convention where they would write a state constitution, send it to Washington, D.C., and they would approve it or reject it. If you were approved, you were eventually admitted as a state to the Union and afforded all the benefits of being a Union state. However, you weren't without rights if you lived in a state without statehood. You were guaranteed certain rights like freedom of religion, trial by jury, the forbiddance of cruel and unusual punishment, and the prohibition of slavery in all the areas up here in black. Anywhere south of these areas down here in white were all slave territory. This was all free territory up here. Back to some more failures. So back to money. At the time period of the Articles of Confederation, we had massive inflation. And that inflation is when you have too many dollars chasing too few goods. The reason there were too few goods is because we had a limited trade system with England directly after the war. And in 1780, one silver dollar was worth 40 paper dollars. Paper money at this point was basically worthless. So the government decided, you know what, let's propose a duty of 5% on all imports. The states said absolutely not because they were terrified of a too strong national government and another King of England situation. Continuing with trade, we had a massive trade deficit. You can see our imports from England are skyrocketing. We're almost at 3.5 million pounds of sterling from England at this point in 1784, a year after the war is officially over. But we're not exporting anything. We're exporting so much less, and that's really bad. We want these exports to be up here and these imports to be somewhere down here. Exports should be up here. That's a good positive trade deficit because we're making more money than we're spending, which is exactly what we want. And this largely happened because of the revolution and England being mad at us and not wanting to be our trade partner. Now, you might say, well, what about France? Except France is about to go through the French Revolution, and that's going to become a huge problem. We start to see the trade deficit narrow when we start to export grain to both England and France during the French Revolution. Now, all this is taking place as we start to take or kind of steal more land from the Native Americans. Between 1768 and 1799, we negotiated treaties with Native Americans to acquire all these territories here in blue and green. All the territories here in red were still Native American land. We signed the Treaty of Grenville, which gave us the right to settle the Ohio River Valley here. And the Indians were granted the northwest corner of the region up here, and up here. The U.S. also would accept native sovereignty or their ability to basically make decisions for themselves. And this is what the United States looked like in 1787. These are the original 13 states here. You can see none of this territory is organized yet, but it will be as time goes on. The final and best glowing examples of the problems of the Articles of Confederation are Shays' Rebellion. Between 1786 and 1787, Daniel Shays, a Western Massachusetts farmer who was frustrated and angry by crushing debt and taxes, basically created this massive rebellion against the Massachusetts government. He was a former soldier in the Continental Army who felt he was owed a big debt of money by the federal government. If the government appears destructive, the people should overthrow the government. That was an idea of the American Revolution, and that's what Daniel Shays promoted to his followers. So, Daniel Shays led a group of disgruntled farmers to the federal arsenal. It's where they store guns, gunpowder, bullets, cannons, etc. in Springfield, Massachusetts. The men attempted to capture the military stores housed there, but the Massachusetts militia mustered just in time to defend the armory and kill 24 of Shays' men. Now, the government had a giant oh no moment when they tried to muster militia the first time and realized all the militiamen were all the rebels, all the people that had fought in the revolution. So the government said, well, okay, we'll muster a militia from the national. Oh, wait, we don't have a national military. So who are we going to use to fight these guys? Because now we have to figure out how to stop the former army soldiers from taking over army supplies. And they got lucky and got enough militiamen together to eventually stop Shay and his rebellion, but not before George Washington realized that there could be no stronger evidence of the want of energy in our governments than these disorders. George Washington realizes that the government needs more power. They need more strength to be able to put down things such as this. So they call the Annapolis Convention of 1786. And that's the end of our